Hardly a day goes by in Washington, D.C. without legislating on behalf of Israel. Since the latest Congress was inaugurated, we have had bills which sanction the International Criminal Court on behalf of Israel, executive orders on anti Semitism, which urge the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Education to deport foreign students critical of Israel and to prosecute pro Palestinian activists under federal conspiracy statutes. We have suspended foreign aid for all governments except for Israel and Egypt, one of the Middle East dictatorships that we bribe to repress the popular will of their people in order to make sure that region is safer for Israel. And at the same time, Americans have considerable skepticism toward arming and funding that foreign government. The latest Gallup polling, which is from over a year ago, shows that Americans are at best extremely divided over U.S. support for Israel. Yet Washington continues to march in bipartisan lockstep to service that country, even though American communities like those in North Carolina and California still need our help. The reason our government so often has the priorities of a foreign country and its citizens over our own is because of the Israel lobby, which is the title of my guest's 2007 book, which he co-wrote with University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer. Joining me now is Harvard professor Stephen Walt, who, much like John Mearsheimer, has presciently predicted many of our foreign policy entanglements and their failed outcomes. Professor Walt, it is really amazing to be able to speak with you. Thanks very much for doing this.
Nice to be with you too.
So I want to first ask you about a misconception that people have about the Israel lobby, that it is representative and composed solely of Jewish people. You and Professor Mearsheimer devote pages toward dispelling that myth and describing the network of Jews and Gentiles alike who work overtime in our nation's capital to ensure that our unconditional support for Israel continues. Especially after October 7th, American Jews are more divided than ever over Israel, with younger generations much likely to empathize with Palestinians than older generations. The protests on campus demonstrated that generational divide. And many of those campus encampments were run by Jewish groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. Yet the lobby is in many ways at the height of its power. Israel supporters and ultra-Zionists occupy the highest levels of power in our government, from UN Ambassador Elise Stefanik, Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee, and Miriam Adelson's personal purchase of the White House under Donald Trump. Can you just define what the Israel lobby is in 2025 as opposed to 2007 and explain why it is that although criticism of Israel has never been more present in our discourse, our government seems to be providing record support for that foreign government?
So I don't think the nature of the Israel lobby has actually changed that much since we wrote our book. Some of the ways in which it operates have become more obvious and more apparent. But its fundamental characteristics are really not that different. What we emphasized in our book and remains true today is that the lobby is defined not by religion and not by ethnicity or anything like that. It's why it's, I think, completely wrong, quite unfair to talk about, say, a Jewish lobby or anything like that. It's defined by its political positions, by the positions it advocates. And the main thing that all the groups that we would call part of the lobby support is for the United States to have a special relationship with Israel, one of essentially unconditional support, one where no matter what Israel does, the United States backs it up. That's what groups like AIPAC and other groups in the lobby are trying to promote. And of course, it's not just AIPAC. There's the Zionist Organization for America. There's Christians United for Israel, a Christian evangelical group as well. And very importantly, and you mentioned this in your opening, very importantly, many American Jews do not believe that we should have a special relationship. They don't support what Israel is doing. They don't like what the United States did, say, over the Gaza war. So in that sense, it's not, again, a monolithic Jewish community as well. As for, where American public opinion is, this is unfortunately an old story in American politics that frequently when you have well-organized lobbying groups, they are able to persuade politicians to follow policies, to enact policies that are opposed by a majority of Americans. Just look at the impact of the NRA, the influence that big pharma has on healthcare and drug prices, and and things like that. So this is a very familiar story in American politics. It just happens to be the most pronounced example of it, I think, in foreign policy, where the United States consistently acts in ways that are harmful to its interests and contrary to what most Americans would normally want.
I want to ask you about a few specific instances or political issues where the Israel lobby has been working recently. So obviously, a chief argument for continuing our unconditional U.S. financing and support for Israel that arose after September 11th was that the perpetrators of 9/11 were part of a broader network of Islamic terror that threatened both the United States and Israel, and therefore the United States should use its military on behalf of Israel to take out Israel's enemies, who, under this formulation, are supposedly our own. And you and John Mearsheimer demonstrate at length in the Israel lobby why that narrative is pure propaganda. For one thing, the U.S. and Israel do not share a common threat of terrorism from Hezbollah, Hamas, and Al Qaeda, who, under this formulation, have the same goals and targets. Rather, U.S. support for Israel is often what generates much of the terrorism in the first place, as you lay out. But these are the arguments that neocons have presented for decades now to try and convince the U.S. to bomb Iran, for instance. And those efforts intensified after October 7th, when groups that align itself with Iran, like Hezbollah, began the retaliation against Israel's assault on Gaza. And as that conflict escalated, we continue to hear from prominent neocons like Barry Weiss that the threats that Israel faces are our own, and that Joe Biden must do more to confront Iran and even bomb that country. And now efforts exist to confront President Trump to do the same. What do you make of how this propaganda tactic you identified years ago has evolved? And what do you think today's current national security officials who do you think that they're as convinced of that argument today as they were when you wrote the Israel lobby?
Well, I haven't seen an enormous evolution in the national security community here, but I haven't the argument that we're sort of partners against terror, which was Benjamin Netanyahu's line back in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. You don't see that getting invoked as much sometimes, but not as much as it used to be. And there's two things to say about it. I mean, first is after September 11th, it was obvious that there were a set of groups out there. This was actually obvious beforehand that were very hostile to the United States and were willing to attack American forces in the region and were willing to attack the United States directly. And I didn't have any problem with the United States going after those groups in the aftermath of September 11th. When you're attacked, I think it's appropriate to respond. But at the same time, what we ignored was, well, why are those groups angry at the United States? What's motivating them as well? And you heard a lot of nonsense, back post 9/11, that they hated American values, that they were fundamentally hostile to the United States as a society. And what, of course, was really bothering them was the policy the United States had adopted in the Middle East. Osama bin Laden was crystal clear that he had many objections to what the United States was doing, but one of his principal objections was our unconditional support for Israel, given how Israel was treating the Palestinians. So it was one thing to, say that, okay, we have a problem here, but solving that problem involved two things. Right. One of them was to try and neutralize the groups that are attacking the United States. And the second one would have been trying to make sure that they don't recreate themselves, that the motivations that are causing these groups to be anti-American are eliminated. Well, we did the first part, but we didn't do the second part. Right. And I think that's why, particularly when you look at a situation today, we still face populations in the Middle East who have a very low opinion of the United States, and where we are likely to see a resurgence of the same kind of anti-American forces, not because they're fundamentally hostile to what America stands for, or I might add what we used to stand for, because that's not as clear anymore, but they're hostile to what the United States is doing in the region. I think this is a pretty obvious point, but it's not a point that groups in the lobby would like people to think too hard about.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because obviously there was the old adage, they hate us for our freedoms. This is how they tried to sell us the war on terror. much in the same way, I think that Israel tries to sell its own war on terror that, oh, they hate us because we're Jewish and not because of the occupation, which we've maintained for decades. I'm wondering, you mentioned that obviously our actions in the Middle East supporting Israel and its occupation have generated a lot of anti-American sentiment and in many ways generated some of the terrorism that we faced on our own soil, like 9/11 or the 1993 World Trade Center attack, which you lay out in the Israel lobby. I'm wondering if you anticipate anything that will come or any repercussions against the United States for all of our military support for Israel over the past 15 or 16 months.
I think that's to be expected. I mean, what the United States has done over the last, since October 7th, I think is unconscionable, where we have effectively provided the military support and the diplomatic protection for what at a minimum are serious war crimes and at a maximum is an attempted genocide. And it's really shocking for the United States to have done that. This has had the temporary effect of, damaging, severely weakening a number of groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, as well, and putting Iran, clearly in a much weaker position. But it's hard for me to believe that it's not going to also be an inspiration for the kind of groups that Osama bin Laden led as well. Ultimately, we have a political issue there, and you generally can't solve political issues simply by dropping bombs on people. And the fact that the United States is now under President Trump starting to talk about ethnic cleansing, of Gaza, the fact that we are turning a blind eye to additional ethnic cleansing on the West Bank. This seems to me is inevitably going to trigger a backlash, and the problem is, I mean, there's a real political issue, almost a strategic issue here, is that there's a vicious cycle that happens. A group of people gets oppressed. They see no way to some kind of political resolution of their grievances. All the forces in the world are stacked against them. And therefore, some of them, not all by any means, but some of them decide the only thing that they can do is some form of violent resistance. And sometimes that takes the form of terrorism, which is, deeply regrettable. But the point is, once they do that, then that, of course, becomes the justification. We can't deal with them. Oh, they're violent. Oh, they're, fundamentally unreasonable. They're not interested in peace. They just have to be eradicated. Oh, and while we're doing that, we might have to eradicate or cleanse or remove all the others who happen to be like them. And I think that, to a large extent, explains the dynamic that we see going on in the Middle East. And Americans, part because they rarely get the full picture very accurately presented to them, because the narrative that you've been describing tends to dominate how this set of issues is covered. And because the United States is a long way away from the Middle East, we don't really understand as a society what's going on there. And we fail to realize that it is actions we are supporting that is creating the problem that we're concerned by. And as long as we continue to support those actions, we're going to continue to face that problem.
Right. And as long as we say as well that, oh, they just naturally and innately hate us because of who we are, that we allow women to wear bathing suits or something, then it allows us to
Well,
justify more and more wars.
and just to pause for a second, this is, the one of the most fundamental dilemmas or conundrums in international politics, right? The inability or unwillingness of people to step back and say, I don't like what some other group or some country is doing. Is it possible that I might be doing something that's causing them to act that way? Right? Now, it may not be true. They may have their own reasons. You may have done nothing to provoke them, but one at least ought to ask the question, there's something I'm doing that might be causing this bad behavior I don't like from somebody else? It's much easier to say, oh, well, they're just like that, They're just that way. It's, I did nothing wrong. I'm the innocent victim here, etc. And one of the most important things people need to do when they're analyzing foreign policy is at least be willing to say, well, how does this look like? How does this issue look from the other side? I don't necessarily have to agree with them, but I should at least try to understand how it looks to them. And maybe, just maybe, there's something I could do, right? Short of eliminating them, something I could do that would solve this problem, that would cause that bad behavior that I object to become, to disappear, to go away, or at least be attenuated. And we tend not to want to do that. It's a little too hard for most people. And that, by the way, it's not unique to Americans. It's a common problem around the world.
There's even a tendency to label all of our adversaries or compare them to Hitler or the worst fascists of the 20th century, to say that, oh, they're unagreeable, they can't be negotiated with. As you point out, in the Israel lobby, we did this with the Soviet Union for many years. It's not just Iran and Russia and all these other countries. Now that we've done this too, we've been saying this about all of our enemies for pretty much as long as ever. I want
Yeah,
to ask you,
that may be
yeah.
changing now, but that's a separate question.
Right, right. I want to ask you just about what we were just talking about, which is the Trump Gaza plan. I mean, what has happened to the Palestinians, especially the Palestinians of Gaza, it's probably the supreme crime of the century. At least over 50,000 have been killed. Estimates put that in the hundred thousands, depending on who you ask. The Lancet said it's almost as high as 180,000, perhaps. And all of these deaths are because of Israel and its U.S. supplied weapons. Trump, I guess to his credit, finally did what Joe Biden's administration refused to do, and place some pressure on Israel to agree to the June ceasefire agreement. He announced that the U.S. would take control of Gaza, that other countries would pay for its reconstruction, and that Palestinians in Gaza will just leave. It's not like Israel has been trying to do that for 15 months without any limits. Now they're just going to leave, and they won't be allowed to return either. It's ethnic cleansing. And it's also remarkably similar to the earlier plan floated by the Biden administration and the Israeli government to drive the Palestinians into the Sinai. At the same time, in the West Bank, efforts are underway to formally annex that territory, and the Israel lobby is working hard in the United States to win U.S. recognition of the occupied territories as part of Israel. Arab governments have been adamant that they will not accept this, that doing so will have political consequences and prevent any normalization between Israel and governments in the Middle East. As you point out in the Israel lobby, our support for Israel and its stubborn policy of subjugating the Palestinians and stealing their land is often irrational and bad for both the United States and even Israel itself. What do you make of the Trump plan for Gaza, and what do you think will be the reaction from not just from Arab governments in the Middle East, if the U.S. continues to support Israel's efforts to construct its own Lebensraum?
Well, I think the Trump plan for Gaza was silly, and it was a sort of typical Trumpian, off the cuff. Well, let's think about this kind of thing. And of course, as you say, it was immediately rejected by Egypt, rejected by Saudi Arabia, rejected by Jordan, rejected by all Arab governments as well, and of course rejected by the Gazans. And I might add, it had a certain fairy tale quality about it. The United States was going to send its troops in, and that would solve the problem. The United States send its troops in, and those troops will be fighting Hamas immediately, and Americans will be shot and killed, and we'll have the same problems occupying Gaza that Israel has had, and why Hamas ultimately kind of fought Israel to a standstill in Gaza as well. We would face the same problems. There's nothing magical about American forces that would allow them to succeed where Israel had enormous difficulty. So the Trump plan didn't make a whole lot of sense. But it did reveal an opening or a willingness to contemplate solutions that the United States had previously not been willing to voice in any kind of serious way. And that is that the solution to this is to just expel the Palestinians. Right? And what people, again, have to step back and realize is that the fundamental problem here is that you have a roughly equal number of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs who want to occupy the same territory. Right, roughly 15 million people total if you add up the Arabs of Gaza, the West Bank, Israel proper, and the Jewish population. And this balance is roughly 50-50, and they don't agree on who should have which parts. And because Israel has been substantially stronger ever since 1948, they've had the lion's share of the territory, and they were able to occupy the West Bank in 1967 and have slowly been colonizing it ever since, with much of the Israeli political spectrum being committed to this idea of a greater Israel, that eventually it all ought to belong to them. I think they are less interested in possessing the Gaza Strip, although they'd be perfectly happy to if they could. And certainly some members of the Israeli right have said that they would like to go back in there and colonize that as well. And the problem with doing that is you then face two problems. If you want to create a greater Israel, the fact is that roughly half the people in that greater Israel are not Israeli Jews. So you either have to run that as a permanent apartheid system, that these people will be denied political rights, that roughly half the country will rule over the other half permanently, or you have to get those people to leave, right? And to getting those people to leave if they don't want to, because they regard it as their homeland, it's where their families are from, it's where they have can trace their ancestry back for generations. If they don't want to leave, then you have to force them out. And that's ethnic cleansing. That's a crime against humanity, right? And so you suddenly now have Americans starting to say, well, yeah, maybe that would be the solution. Again, no one wants to say that quite out loud. No one wants to say, well, we'll back it, we'll support it, we'll provide the trucks, etc. But that's kind of where this is leading. And by the way, that has one other consequence. It has non-trivial effects, probably dangerously destabilizing effects on whatever countries they go to. Right? Whether it's Jordan, whether it's Egypt as well, which is why those governments don't want this to happen. So it's not only completely unfair to Palestinians who have suffered mightily for decades, but of course it's going to have consequences for others. It's also going to have consequences for the stability of some Arab governments like Saudi Arabia, which is why the Saudis are not in favor of this as an answer. And this unfortunately takes us all the way back to, well, what is the solution? And again, it's not a perfect solution, but the only viable solution anyone's ever come up with is, well, there have to be two states. That's what the United Nations originally proposed back in 1947. That's what the United States has claimed to want for years. That's what the Palestinians have said they want, a viable state on the West Bank and Gaza. And that's what Israel has refused to grant them. And unfortunately, the United States, while pretending to be an honest broker here, has acted, in the words of former U.S. negotiator Aaron Miller, like Israel's lawyer. And we've never been willing to put any significant pressure on Israel to actually go to a two-state solution. Quite the contrary, under the Biden administration, we actively colluded in an absolutely brutal assault that put the two-state solution even further away than ever. I should add just one other point here. I think it's important to recognize that although occupied populations have the right to resist, right, according to the law of belligerent occupation in international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions, that doesn't authorize them to commit war crimes. I believe Hamas committed war crimes on October 7th and should be condemned for it. It's noteworthy that Hamas leaders were indicted by the International Criminal Court, as I believe they should have been. And I believe Israel was within its rights to respond to this. Israel was not within its rights to then, of course, defy international law and conduct war crimes of its own and engage in disproportionate attacks against civilians, denying relief aid, and all the other things we have seen while Israeli politicians were talking about, talking in very genocidal terms about eliminating Palestinians. But we shouldn't say that this is entirely bad things only done by one side. Bad things have been done by both sides. And the United States, unfortunately, has favored one of those sides unconditionally and done relatively little to help the other.
So I want to go back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier with Iran. Nothing has really strengthened Iran more and empowered its foreign policy hardliners than U.S. support for Israel and military action on behalf of it in the Middle East. You explain that since the 1990s, the U.S. has pursued a counterproductive strategy toward Iran, and that because of our support for Israel's occupation of the Palestinians, we alienate countries in the Middle East who would otherwise work with us toward mutual interests. The U.S. invasion of Iraq was another key event which helped strengthen Iran, which in many ways was done at the urging of people like Benjamin Netanyahu, who came to the United States to advocate for that war. Even the supposed threat that Iran poses in the Middle East, in many respects, derives from its desire for deterrence against an increasingly aggressive Israel, which is currently invading and has bombed most of its neighbors. How do you see the behavior of the United States since October 7th as being counterproductive toward what you view as our long-term goals with Iran and the Middle East? And do you mind just clarifying what you think our goals with Iran ought to be?
Hmm. Our goal with Iran over time should be, I think, twofold. One is, as a general policy, we want to have a decent working relationship with Iran. We ought to be striving for a sort of normal relationship with Iran, not the one we have today. And I'll say more about that in a second. And we want to try and make sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, because we are generally opposed to the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, our policy ever since the Iranian Revolution really has pushed the other way. We've had a very difficult relationship with Iran. Not all of that, by the way, connected to Israel. And of course, Iran has come very close to getting a nuclear weapon, just has not decided to actually weaponize, but has all the wherewithal to do that. And for me, for very obvious reasons. Um, so again, as I said, the relationship with the United States and Iran is going to be troubled, even if Israel didn't exist. But it's gotten worse since the 1990s. And it's worth remembering that, for example, the Palestinian cause was not a big deal for Iran in the 1980s. They were not vocal. They didn't have much of a connection to groups like Hamas or other Palestinian resistance groups. And they decided to get more actively involved there after the 1991-92 war and the Madrid Peace Conference that the first Bush administration sponsored. And the reason they got more actively involved in the center of the Middle East was that we excluded them from that conference. We put together this conference, we're going to start developing a plan for reordering the Middle East, and we told Iran that they weren't invited. And Iran decided, I think quite reasonably, that you couldn't develop a security architecture for the whole region that didn't pay any attention to their interests. And at that point, they started forging closer ties with Palestinians as a way of reminding the United States and others they couldn't be forgotten. They couldn't be left out. All right. It's not that they wanted to destroy Israel. It's not that they wanted to eliminate all the Jews or anything like that. They wanted the United States and others to pay some attention to their interests while we were busy trying to remake the region. And at that point, the relationship starts to deteriorate. And in particular, the Israel lobby starts getting much more exercised and starting to target Iran as a serious potential threat. And it's worth also remembering that there were several occasions under President Rafsanjani, under President Rouhani, where the Iranians actually reached out to the United States and wanted to try and improve relations. We talk about this at length in our book, that each time, groups like AIPAC immediately rallied to stop Americans from actually reaching out and opening closer ties with Iran. If you fast forward a bit, you have efforts under the Bush 43, George W. Bush's administration. They were going to remake the whole Middle East, starting with Iraq and then going on to Iran and Syria. right? And of course, Iran objected to that. We also started putting increasingly tough sanctions on them, tried to stop them from enriching uranium. None of that worked. And finally, the Obama administration is able to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran in 2015, where Iran agrees, right, to dismantle a bunch of its centrifuges, to give up a whole lot of enriched uranium, most of its enriched uranium, and basically step back from the nuclear brink, from the brink of getting nuclear weapons. And the deal was they'll do that, which is what we wanted, and we would start lifting economic sanctions, allow their economy to recover, start moving towards a more normal relationship. And Donald Trump, in his infinite folly, a couple of years later, tore up the deal, leading, of course, Iranians now to say, why should we renegotiate anything with you? We can't trust you at all. We made a deal with you and you broke it. And another potential problem there. So fast forward to today, Iran has been, I think, severely hurt over the last year or so with the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, the damage inflicted on Hezbollah, but it's not going to surrender. And I think what we've done is we've created even greater incentives for Iran to think seriously about getting nuclear weapons. And I suspect that hardliners in Iran are making this point that, if we don't find a way to protect ourselves, we're going to be next on the hit list. And it's possible that the Trump administration will try to work out a big deal. But Donald Trump has appointed a bunch of people who are real Iran hawks, and there will be pressure from the lobby and others to keep the screws tightened on Iran. And if Iran does decide that they have to be like North Korea, that the only way they can be safe is if they have a nuclear weapon of their own, then Trump and others will face the decision of whether or not to take military action to try and prevent that from happening. We can't eliminate the knowledge of how to build a nuclear weapon or the knowledge of how to enrich uranium. We may be able to delay that decision, but if we or Israel or a combination of the two of us use military force against Iran, then all bets are off as to what happens in the region. Whether Iran then starts attacking oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, et cetera. I think Donald Trump actually has no desire to get involved in a big war in the Middle East. He's seen how well that's gone for some other American presidents, but he may find himself facing that decision at some point in the future if he's not extremely careful.
So I want to turn now to where you are now, which is Harvard University. Well, I should first just start off by saying that there's been a major free speech assault on your campus that I want to get into. But I want to go back first because you did document the heavy-handed tactics that the Israel lobby employs to silence its critics in your 2007 book. And chief among them is the accusation of anti-Semitism and bigotry that is directed at any American who questions unconditional U.S. support for the foreign government of Israel. And if you're Jewish like me, then you get called a self-hating Jew. But now, at least, the criticisms of Israel, as we've been talking about, are much more mainstream. But attempts to censor those criticisms continue all across places like social media, most notably with the attempt to ban the app TikTok explicitly because that platform allows too much pro-Palestinian speech. But really, the effort to discipline and censor the free speech of American citizens on behalf of Israel has escalated since October 7th. And I want to ask you about how this has happened at Harvard. We could backtrack to October when Harvard students wrote letters after siding with the rights of Palestinians. Billionaires and prominent board members like Bill Ackman bought giant trucks to publicly label those students anti-Semites. The Israel lobby created blacklists of students and young professionals to render them unhirable based on their views toward a foreign government. And now, as part of a recent legal settlement, Harvard has adopted the radical IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and they vowed to punish the students and staff whose speech fits within that framework on campus. If you look at that definition, many of the arguments made by respected scholars like yourself and Sarah Roy at Harvard actually fall under that IRHRA definition. For example, it is anti-Semitic under this definition to, quote, hold Israel to a different standard than any other democratic country. And in your book, you make it a point not to do that, which is to talk only and exclusively about Israel. And I think you correctly justify it by the fact that the U.S. spends disproportionate amounts of resources on Israel than more than any other foreign government. And therefore, that special relationship itself justifies special attention to it. But under that new framework, it's anti Semitic to say that or to make those arguments. What do you make of the campus free speech crackdown on criticisms of Israel generally and on your campus at Harvard specifically?
Well, I'm not going to get into to details about this because I'd have to go back and refresh my memory as to preceding events. But I think the behavior of most American universities has been pretty shameful here, and we've lost sight of the need to preserve as open and free a debate as possible. I have no question that at many college campuses, there were people who've said things they shouldn't have said, on both sides of this. I'm sure that undergraduate students have yelled things at each other that are regrettable. I think the idea that American college campuses, to include Harvard, are somehow hotbeds of anti-Semitism is ludicrous. And it's remarkable that the people who have thrown this accusation around at various points can never come up with a long list of particulars documenting this. If they they might point to an anti-Semitic placard that gets posted someplace, but of course that could be posted by anybody. They don't have a student associated with it or a faculty member. And in fact, if you look across the faculty of a place like Harvard, I think it's overwhelmingly either neutral or largely supportive of Israel as well. The idea that there are lots of people on the Harvard community, who either are anti-Israeli or even more absurdly anti-Jewish is just nonsense. So it's unfortunate that it got weaponized in this way. The danger here, it seems to me, is not that people are going to be punished for being critical of Israel. I'm not concerned that, I'll get censured or my salary will get cut or something like that. And I think that's true of other faculty members. The difficulty with embracing the IHRA definition or some of the other steps that universities have taken is you end up encouraging self-censorship. People don't want to be bothered. They worry that it might affect their advancement within the institution if they want to maybe, run a program or be in charge of a center or become a dean someday. They realize that that might be a problem if they're too controversial, too outspoken on this issue. Certainly, younger faculty will be careful. Instead of instilling an environment where people question things and can have an honest discussion on either side, you have a situation where people are tiptoeing on eggshells because they're afraid of offending someone. They don't want to be the person that some wealthy donor is calling up and complaining about. And that, of course, is completely antithetical to what's supposed to happen at a university. What we're supposed to be doing at universities is having free and open and critical discussions, civil, not threatening, not violent, not name calling, right? But actually serious discussions. And what was happening after October 7th was one of those issues that people could have different opinions on and should be able to talk about in a serious, forthright, honest way. They might not agree, but it was sufficiently important to the United States and to the world that you wanted to be able to have that kind of a conversation. I might add, it was a tragedy, a human tragedy on both sides, but it was also something that you wanted students to be able to learn about. Right? This was I hate to use this phrase, but it's a teachable moment, right? This is what universities exist to do. And because of outside pressure and because university leaders are very sensitive to that kind of pressure, both political and financial, we tended to cave. And people wanted the problem to go away. And unfortunately, that meant trying to silence people as much as possible. And I think, again, it's a place that, 20, 30 years from now, we will look back and say that was a place where these institutions fell short of their professed ideals.
I want to ask about some specifics because I really can't think of any other foreign government where there's limits at universities on how and you're allowed to criticize it and the things that you're allowed to say about that country. And I'll give an example because we were just talking about Iran, and you work at the foreign policy school there. I bet that all the time people talk about bombing Iran, the millions of or thousands of people who would be killed doing that, I guess who cares in this case? But you're allowed to make that argument. You could say we should bomb Iran, North Korea, we should put these sanctions on Venezuela, which kill 40,000 people. You can make those arguments. It's all permissible. But when you're talking about Israel, or even in the most extreme cases, right, justifying or endorsing what Hamas did on October 7th, I personally don't see any reason why that should be off limits for debate, especially at a university, because you're allowed to make the arguments about any other country or group that you want to bomb. So
Well, I mean, I think that you're pointing to sort of classic situations of foreign policy orthodoxy that we think that what we think might find necessary to do is perfectly okay and can be talked about, and if anyone else tries to act similarly or tried to respond in kind, that's totally illegitimate. And universities are not immune to that kind of conventional wisdom, right? That if you're not very careful, it's very easy to sort of fall into that trap. And that's one of the things that, again, the values of a good academic institution should be to push back against this, to be more welcoming of people saying, wait a second, hold on, there's a double standard being applied here, or you're all saying these things, but step back and think for a second about what you're saying. You're saying it's so important to accomplish this goal that you're willing to kill 50,000 people to do it. Just accept that, and that's what we should be encouraging in an environment, like Harvard or any other university as well, as opposed to sort of just nodding our heads and saying, well, I've heard a lot of famous people with government experience say this, so I guess it must be okay. And again, we want to, none of us are perfect. People tend to conform to prevailing sets of ideas, etc. But the culture of a university, at least in my view, should be trying to challenge that as much as we can.
So I have one final question, and it's about something that we haven't talked about yet today. It's about Ukraine.
Ah,
Um, just as a brief background for listeners, I think it's important to just mention that I don't think it's fair to say that the conflict began on February 2022. Maybe you'll agree. I think it really began in February of 2014, when the U.S. forced the elected president, Yanukovych, to flee that country, igniting a breakaway movement in the east, which was then violently suppressed by the government of Ukraine, which just happened to be handpicked by people like Victoria Nuland. And that escalated into a civil war between Ukrainians in the East and West, which then became a proxy war between Russia and the United States and NATO after Russia's illegal invasion then in February 2022. But negotiations for an end to that conflict are now finally ongoing, and it looks like Ukraine will retain less territory than if Zelensky had signed on to a March 2022 Ankara agreement, which would have ended the war 3 years ago. You are someone like John Mearsheimer, like the late Stephen F. Cohen, who warned that NATO expansion from warned against NATO expansion for many years, and have looked for a diplomatic resolution to this conflict and a less hostile relationship between our country and Russia generally. The latest news on negotiations is that Trump and Zelensky have come to an agreement over minerals, that Trump has ruled out NATO membership for Ukraine, remarking that NATO membership for Ukraine is probably what caused the war in the first place. In the end, we did exactly what people like John Mearsheimer and yourself said would happen. We've led Ukraine down the primrose path. We've sacrificed a generation of Ukrainian and Russian men over who rules the eastern provinces of that country. And we have completely destroyed Ukraine with mines, cluster munitions, and other unexploded ordinances that litter the countryside still today. And now we're going to take their minerals as well. So, what do you make of the ongoing peace negotiations and how this war is resolving?
Well, a couple things. I might disagree with you on some of the historical narrative, not entirely, but there's some details there that I think are more complicated than what you just depicted. But certainly, people like me had been warning for a long time that American policy towards Europe and towards Russia was eventually going to cause some kind of an explosion. Some kind of Russian response, and we finally saw it happen in Ukraine, beginning in 2014, and then more visibly and actively in 2022. And I understand, I think, why Russia acted as it did. I also think that invading another country is not legal. It wasn't legal when we did it in 2003, and it wasn't legal when Russia did it in 2022. That said, I believe the Harris administration, if we'd had one, would have moved to try and work out a peace deal as well. I think Biden wasn't going to, and was certainly not going to admit he was that she would go there. But I think that almost anybody who'd looked carefully at the situation in Ukraine last fall understood that ending the war was the best thing to do. That it was completely unrealistic to imagine that Ukraine could regain the territory it had lost, certainly could not regain Crimea, that dreams of bringing Vladimir Putin to The Hague for war crimes trials or whatever were completely fanciful, and therefore the only thing to do was negotiate a peace deal. Now, how you do that is important, and I think we wanted an arrangement that would be the best possible, and it's not obvious to me that that's what the Trump administration is trying to do at all. That the difficulty that they've sort of given Putin what he wants without asking what they're going to get in return, and I don't think that's the best way to negotiate. And what has to happen here is an arrangement that neither side, neither Ukraine nor Russia, wants to tamper with or challenge in the future. And that means providing Ukraine with enough wherewithal, enough security assistance that it feels reasonably secure and can defend itself against Russia resuming the war. But it also means reassuring Russia that whatever their fears were about NATO enlargement and an attempt to bring Ukraine into the Western alliance, attempt to build up Ukraine's military, to have American forces and advisors and intelligence services actively involved in Ukraine, whatever those have to be met as well. And furthermore, that in larger terms, a security order in Europe would have to be developed that did not put Russia in a position where it felt like it was constantly being threatened and constantly had to try and undermine that order. And that's something Americans don't want to hear right now, because we've decided that Russia is just innately evil and Putin is an imperialist and wants to recreate the old Soviet Union, and that they have no legitimate security fears, which again I think is mistaken. That doesn't mean that we give away the store. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to help Europe develop the wherewithal to feel secure as well. But it does mean being able to have a more honest and candid conversation about how we got here, and what's the appropriate way to get out in the future. I want to add one other point, though, because it dovetails with our earlier conversation about the Middle East. What to me was really striking about the situation in Ukraine was that in some respects it mirrored what goes on when we talk about Israel-Palestine. That when the war started, it became almost impossible to suggest that the United States or its allies had done anything wrong at any point. That the other side was entirely evil. It was entirely their fault. They weren't responding to things we had done. They had just decided to do this horrible thing. And if you suggested that that maybe wasn't the case, that maybe we had played a role in causing this, that maybe to a large extent we were as much to blame as Russia. Yes, Putin is responsible for the war, but we are not blameless. If you even said that, right, you immediately got attacked for being a sympathetic to Putin, for being, an appeaser, for being anti-Ukrainian. And again, this was not a serious set of arguments. These were people who were just trying to shut everybody up, right? Shut people up, keep them off the op-ed pages, and not get people to think seriously about, well, how did we get here? And to explain why something happened is not necessarily to defend it or justify it. To explain why Russia did what it did is not to say we think what Russia did was just fine. Quite the contrary. But if you don't understand how you got into a problem, it's usually much harder to get your way out of it. And I think the only thing I will give Donald Trump credit for on this one was his willingness to sort of acknowledge that this war had to end, and that it was going to have to end with a compromise. I worry that his desire for a deal is going to lead to a less than ideal outcome, worse than we might have gotten otherwise. And we'll have to see if my fears are borne out there or not.
Well, Professor, it was really a privilege to get the opportunity to speak to you today. It really means a lot, and I hope that we can talk again soon.
Okay, nice talking with you too.